It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. John O'Doherty. He's a professor of psychology at Caltech. He's been there since 2004. I'm very happy he can join us today, although virtually, so it's our loss, but here we are. He's been also the director of the Caltech Brain Imaging Center for some time. He has his PhD in experimental psychology from the University of Oxford in 2000. And he was previously the Thomas Mitchell Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience at Trinity College in Dublin, where he received his BA, and he was elected fellow there. John is also very much internationally known. He's been a Kinross Research Fellow at the University of College London from in the 2000s, and a visiting professor at the University of Amsterdam, and a faculty member of the Parmenides Foundation in Germany. He was elected fellow of the Association of Psychological Sciences in 2009. Dr. O'Doherty has some seminal articles on reward learning and decision-making with numerous publications in top-tier journals. A very fascinating work dissociating the neural systems of goal-directed versus habitual control. And he has really highlighted the role of the human prefrontal cortex, including the VMPFC, the OFC, in differentiating types of associative learning. He's very well known for his studies in the human brain using a wide range of contexts. He primarily uses fMRI, but also TMS and lesion samples to probe causality in the human with regard to reward learning, decision-making, and motivation. And he has a highly innovative contribution to the computational investigations of brain and behavior. One of our favorite, although there are so many, but I'll mention just one, is the testing of the arbitration hypothesis, the system that arbitrates the degree of model-based versus model-free control over behavior with a critical role assigned to the anterior prefrontal cortex. So Dr. O'Doherty has been an influential figure in social, cognitive, and affective neuroscience. He has a very high H-index factor and any type of measure you can think about. He has numerous papers with thousands of citations. And he's now also an associate editor of Journal of Neuroscience. Something anecdotal and more personal, we just were discussing how should we call ourselves. One of my postdocs, Ahmed Sisseli, was a PhD student of Elizabeth Tricomi, and she was the PhD student of Dr. O'Doherty. So if it doesn't make us cousins, maybe it makes us in-laws, scientifically. So thank you very much, John, for coming over. And I'm really looking forward for the talk and then the visit of our lab, all of it virtual. And then by the end of the talk, anybody who has questions, write it down in chat or just raise your hand and I'll take care of it. So thank you very much for coming over. Go ahead, Jim.
Great. Thank you very much, Rita, for that very nice introduction. And I'm very, when I agreed to give this talk, none of this had happened, none of the pandemic. And so I was looking forward to, visiting you guys in person. And I would have been able to enjoy the clean air of New York City, as opposed to here where we do not have clean air right now. So if I cough, it's because of the fires, not because of some other reasons that I might be coughing right now. Okay, so let me just try and share the screen and tell me if this works. Okay, are you guys seeing the screen share now? Okay, excellent. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is not on the topic of arbitration, which Rita alluded to, is some of the work that we've been doing recently. But I just want to talk about value signals in the brain. So, sorry, let me see if I can advance. Maybe I need to do this to advance. Okay. So we know that humans and other animals are capable of making decisions between things, right? So we're very good at making decisions, and some decisions are very simple, such as, which item should I choose? Which food item should I choose between this apple, this orange, and this hamburger, right? And for the last, I guess hundreds of years in economics and more recently in psychology, and then maybe the last 20 years or so in neuroscience, people have been interested in trying to understand the mechanism by which humans and other animals make these kinds of simple decisions. And one of the kind of most influential ideas is that the brain basically represents something, a scalar value, which basically says, how much do I like this item? Will I like this item? What's the kind of potential benefit, the net gain versus the net of losses that might accrue to me if I select this item? Okay, benefits versus aversive outcomes. And so you could imagine that there's some kind of scalar function, and we call this value or utility, the economists call it. I'm just going to refer to it as value. And so the economists have these models, that theoretical models, in which you assume that people are acting as if they are trying to maximize this value function. So choosing those things that have the most benefit. And one of the, I think, major insights that's come from neuroeconomics over the last 20 years is that actually in the brain, we see signals like this. So it's not just as if people are maximizing these things. These signals appear to be represented in the brain at the time when people are making decisions. And here's just one example of a study that Hilke Plasma, myself, and Antonio Rangel did, in which we had people make choices about food items. And all they had to do was they saw a food item and they could say, well, how much would I like to buy this item, as if I was kind of just buying a snack food item at the store. And we can look for areas of the brain correlating with those value signals. And one area in particular that I'm just going to highlight today is the medial orbital frontal cortex, or it's part of the, more broadly, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. And activity in this region appears to correlate with value at the time of decision making. And we've also looked at value not just for food items, but for other kinds of items. So for example, here, we did a study with Vic Chibb and Antonio Rangel, in which we had people make decisions about how much they would actually like to obtain either food items or non-comestible consumer items like t-shirts or Star Wars DVDs, or even just to kind of have the chance to play a monetary gamble. And they could basically say how much would they like to do any of these things or obtain any of these goods. And we can also then look to see if there are parts of the brain correlating with those signals. And indeed, if you look in the brain, we again see this medial orbital ventromedial prefrontal cortex correlating with the value in each different category of goods. And we can even look for areas that are overlapping, commonly activated to different categories of goods. And you see, again, this very rather circumscribed region of ventromedial prefrontal cortex correlating with these value signals at the time of decision making. And we also know that if you look across a large number of studies that have been done in the literature, looking for correlates of value signals, again, you see this kind of the same ventromedial prefrontal cortex area that's just very robustly represented in the literature. So it's a very replicable, replicated finding. But we also know that actually, if you take a patient, so this is work from Antonio Bishara and Antonio Damasio and colleagues, if you take patients that have damage, sustained damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, such as, for example, from a tumor that gets resected or other sources of damage, basically patients with that type of lesion become impaired at making very simple decisions. So this is kind of a classic decision-making task that many of you will know, called the Iowa gambling task, in which patients have to make a decision between different card decks that have different probabilities of winning and losing money. And essentially, compared to healthy controls, patients with damage to this structure show difficulties in basically learning to make a choice of the right option, the better options to maximize the rewards. Move on to the next one. But what I want to talk about today is not the fact that we know that there is these value signals there, and those value signals seem to have some causal relationship to driving behavior. I want to talk about how are these decision values actually constructed? How are they built by the brain, right? So they're kind of clearly there somewhere. And so what are the mechanisms by which when we observe an object, we come to ascribe value to that object in the world. Now, kind of classically in the literature, and also a lot of the work that I've been doing over the last 20 years, has been about the fact that we learn values via learning. So, you know, classically you would see a stimulus, and that stimulus gets paired with another reward. You know, so for example, a cue gets paired with food, and that cue then takes on value. Okay, and so that's been, you know, a very much very influential idea, that reinforcement learning, learning about the value of things through trial and error, through getting feedback, is the way in which we acquire value for things in the world. And that's, you know, certainly true. I'm not trying to argue against that. But what I'm saying is that that isn't a sufficient explanation for how value signals actually get computed. And the reason for that is that value signals are very flexible. We can change them very instantaneously based on changes in our internal motivational state or changes in the external world. So for example, context. I might like going to parties, but probably maybe during a pandemic, I might not, okay? I might have particular objectives, right? I might want to lose weight. So maybe my value for food might change if I want to lose weight versus if I'm wanting to eat food to carb up for running a marathon, right? And also my internal motivational state. How hungry am I? How thirsty am I? How lonely am I to meet people? Those are also going to influence my value signals. So we can't just rely on reinforcement learning or associative learning to understand how value signals are computed. What I'm going to argue today is that value signals are actually actively constructed, or can be, at least a certain type of value signal, which is used for goal-directed behavior. Okay, let me just move on to the next. So just to show you some causal data, I'm not really going to go into this anymore, but this is a study we did at the University of Iowa with Dan Trinnell, and we took patients that had damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, similar cohort to the patients discussed earlier for the Bashara study. And we had them perform actions. So they basically had to press buttons on a computer to get one of two different foods. And so one food was a savory food, snack food, and another food was a sweet food, sugary food, candy. And basically they got these little kind of gumballs would come down and dispense small amounts of this food. So they learned that when they perform particular actions, they get particular outcomes. And what we then did was we fed them to satiety on one of the foods. So for example, if they had been making a choice for goldfish crackers, then we fed them until they're satiated on goldfish crackers. And what we found was that patients who did not have damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, so whether they were actually healthy controls or had damage outside of the lesions outside of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, they were able to decrease the responding on the action associated with the now devalued food, okay, relative to the other food that was not devalued, okay. But patients with damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex did not change their behavior. So they weren't able to update the value of the actions after this devaluation. So what this is also speaking to is that there is some process going on whereby in ventromedial prefrontal cortex and possibly other parts of the brain too, there's an active computation of value given the current motivational state of the individual. Okay. So how might value get constructed in the brain? Well, if you think of any stimulus, let's say this purple triangle here, this triangle has attributes or features, okay? And so we know that we've studied actually in visual and sensory neuroscience, including the visual system, how features get recognized by the brain and that then get combined together to create perceptions of what an object is, or other aspects of an object, properties of an object. And so here you can think of this triangle. It has different attributes, right? So it has a size, it has a shape, it has a color, okay? And so the idea is that maybe what's going on is that we construct value by taking into account the individual features of a stimulus, and then somehow integrating over those features to compute an overall value signal. So let me just kind of illustrate that a little bit more concretely. So imagine this, this cake here, I guess this red velvet cake. And this red velvet cake clearly has attributes, right? It has features. It has a content of carbohydrates, a certain amount of carbs. It has fat, right? It contains protein. It contains vitamins. It also has other things like a taste, flavor, odor, olfactory component. It has texture, right? And so on. And so the idea is that maybe what the brain might do is when you perceive an object, a stimulus, you basically decode the attributes of that stimulus. So in this case, how much carb, how much fat, how much protein, and so on. And then you assign weights over those, okay? So there's a weight assigned to each of these things. And those weights basically specify how you integrate over the attribute content in order to compute an overall value signal, okay? So you just basically multiply the weights by the content, and then you get a sum, which is the value, overall value. And so if this kind of active construction goes on, it actually enables you to understand how we can flexibly change our value signals over time. Because what we could say is, let me just move to the next slide. Well, let's say I've eaten all of these cupcakes, 15 minutes before I have to make a decision about whether I want to eat some cake, some velvet cake. Well, if I've eaten all these cupcakes, then maybe I'm satiated. My motivation for pursuing another food that is high in carb and high in fat and so on might be decreased, right? Because I've already satiated on those features and those attributes, and maybe then my value for the red velvet cake will go down. Or you could think of other examples. If I decide that I want to go on a diet, well, then maybe I'll devalue also, depending on the type of diet I'm pursuing, I might devalue some of those attributes and change those weights accordingly, which would then change the types of foods I would prefer. Okay. So the first part of the talk, I just want to go through a study that we've done a few years ago, looking at whether the brain represents these kinds of features or attributes when people are making decisions about food. And then I want to get into an even more kind of challenging and maybe a bit more abstract problem about value, which is how we assign value to images, to visual scenes, such as, for example, works of art. Okay, so can we kind of extend this idea into this very maybe challenging domain to try and understand how people might compute value? Okay, so in this study with Shinsuke Suzuki and Logan Cross in my lab, what we did was we basically did a very similar experiment to the one I described earlier that Hilke Plassmann ran, in which people see food items. So they come into the lab, they're hungry, they've been kind of food deprived for 4 to 6 hours. So they're motivated for food items. And they know that they're basically going to be making decisions about food. We give them an endowment on every trial. So we say you have $3 to spend. And you can basically decide how much you want to pay for a food item. And what we do is that after the experiment is over, we select one trial at random. And if the amount that you said you were going to pay is above a price that we select, that the computer selects randomly, then you get to keep that item. So let's say if you think the red velvet cake's worth $3 and we select a price of $2, then you get to keep the food, okay? But if you decide that you really don't want the item, you can say, well, I'm going to pay $0 for it. And then you'll always keep the money, okay, on that trial. So it's a way of trying to assess people's values. And this comes from the behavioral economics literature, so it's called willingness to pay. And so we get that we have people in the scanner and we have them do this task. So it's exactly the same as what has been done before. Nothing new there. But then what we did was, after they'd been scanned, we showed them the items again, each food item, and we got them to rate the content of different attributes or different features. So we said, well, how high is this item in fat? So we got like a rating scale of, is it very high or not so high? How high is it in salt? How high is it in carbohydrates? How high? We also separated out carbs from sugar, although of course sugars are carbs, but anyway. How high is it in protein? How high is it in vitamin, and so on, okay? So we got these different ratings. And one thing that you can say is, well, how good are people actually in judging the attribute, the content of a particular food item? And so we could compare their judgment of the content against the actual objective nutritive content, such as, for example, on the labels, or according to kind of, I guess, FDA provides information about these things for foods. So we could basically look at that information, supposedly objective, whether it really is or not, we don't know. But we can see that there's a very high correlation between what they think the food contains and what the food actually contains. So they're actually relatively good at judging these attributes. Okay. So what we could then do is we took people's values, right? The willingness to pay is a measure of their value for the food items. And we can say, well, can we predict? So can we use a regression model to say, take their beliefs over the attributes and look to see if if their behavior, their ratings of willingness to pay can be predicted by the attributes, okay? And what we found was that we actually could do this. And so it's also important to bear in mind, this is out of sample. So in other words, we train the weights on some foods and then we test on novel foods, okay? And so what we can show is that we can, if we take an individual, we can predict to a reasonably good degree of accuracy what their value is based on learning weights, what their weights are over these attributes in this regression model, if that makes sense. And what we can actually do is show that it's the attributes, there's a specific set of attributes actually. So we had a larger set of attributes and we looked for those attributes that best predicted people's food preferences. And it turns out that, at least in this sample, it was the fat content, the carbohydrate content, the protein content, and also vitamin content, which might be a proxy for just kind of, you know, how good do they think this is? Those beliefs are actually the ones that best predicted value. And actually, we could still predict value based on the objective. So we just take the objective content, and we could still predict people's value to a reasonable degree, but we actually did better if we just took their subjective beliefs rather than the objective beliefs, the objective content. And it's not predicted that well by the overall, their overall beliefs about the calorie content or the objective calorie content. So it's not just a kind of a proxy for, you know, how much the energy density of the food, for example. Let me just move on to the next slide. So armed with that and showing that we could actually pick people's behavior, their value ratings based on these attributes, these feature representations, we then look to see, well, could we find evidence for these features being represented in the brain? And what we hypothesized was that maybe we would find these in the orbitofrontal cortex, and especially in the lateral part of the orbitofrontal cortex, because we know that the lateral part of orbitofrontal cortex receives inputs from the sensory parts of the brain, including the visual area, as well as the gustatory and olfactory systems. And so this was a kind of the hypothesis we had was that we would see these kinds of attribute level representations maybe in the lateral orbitofrontal. And we also thought, well, maybe we'll see more of the value signals in medial orbitofrontal. And what we found was that we actually, this is just a decoding. So we're basically training a classifier to recognize the amount of value that a person has been exposed to on a particular trial, or the amount they've said they're willing to pay on a given trial. And so can we decode that from the brain activity? So that would show that there is a value representation in those areas. And we found that we could actually do this both laterally and medially. So there are value signals, which again is consistent with the literature. We tend to see them in humans more in the medial, but there are sufficiently large numbers of studies also find these value signals laterally too. So we could basically decode value from the brain activity. This is a searchlight that's kind of over the orbital frontal cortex. And my internet is unstable, so I don't know if people can hear me, but please let me know if you can't. Okay. So what about these nutritive factors? Okay, these nutritive components, these features. So if we use the same approach, we can also decode but the fat content, carbohydrate content, protein content, and vitamin content from the lateral lobe of the frontal cortex. So what this is here is just over the whole region of interest defined over the lateral lobe of the frontal cortex. Can we kind of decode these things better than chance from the activity? And this is where we use the searchlight to look for particular hotspots that contain this information. So we can see that all of these different components are actually encoded in the lateral lobe of the frontal cortex. And interestingly, we couldn't do as well in decoding these attributes from the medial lobe of the frontal cortex. And so that might suggest at least that these signals are more robustly contained in lateral versus medial lobe of the frontal. Okay. And another thing that we were interested in at the time was, well, obviously these food items are, they're presented visually to participants. So there are going to be all these kind of visual features of the food. And some, obvious things like the luminance, the contrast, the different color components, the hue, the saturation, and so on, brightness. And we said, well, can we decode, are those really just what we're seeing? Is it just the fact that these attributes that we think of as nutritive components are really just, reflecting or correlated with, or you could say confounded by? That's what we were thinking at the time, but actually I think we'll see that that's actually not the way to think about it. You could say, well, are those what's driving the effect? And we could basically then just take the images and extract statistics from those images, such as luminance, contrast, and so on. We could find that, yes, we can decode that from primary visual cortex, which is not a surprise. Those attributes are represented there. But in the lateral lobe of the frontal cortex, we couldn't decode these better than chance. Now, the reason why I'm saying, I'm not really sure it's a good idea to think of these as confounds, and we'll see a bit more when we get to the art study, is because actually the way in which you have to decode from a visual image of a food, you have to decode the nutritive content is ultimately to use the visual information to make an inference about what the nutritive content is, right? You have maybe combining that with memory and other things. Have I had this food before? Do I know what a Twinkie is? And so on. But it's ultimately from the visual information. So the one way to think about this is that this is the low-level part. The visual code is the low-level part of the way in which you're decoding value. And it's more of like a hierarchical implementation. And we'll get to that later when we talk about art. So the other thing that we did was we tried to see, well, if there is this attribute information in lateral orbital frontal cortex representing these nutritive components, well, then how are those then integrated into a value signal? And so what we did was we looked at the areas that are representing each of these attributes, those kind of blobs that came out of the searchlight. And we said, well, let's look at the correlation between those blobs and areas coding value, okay? That is different when you're actually making decision versus when you're not. So at the time of the decision making, we want to see areas that show increased coupling between those attribute areas and the value areas. And you can look at this for the value areas in lateral orbital frontal cortex versus medial orbital frontal cortex. And what we found was that yes, there's some evidence of increased connectivity for some of the features in lateral orbitofrontal, but it's much more strongly the case that you see this kind of increase in connectivity between lateral and medial at the time of decision making, suggesting that maybe the value signal is actually being integrated initially into medial orbitofrontal cortex by integrating over those attribute representations. And so maybe that's the way in which this is being computed, and maybe less so, maybe the value signal is then being sent to the lateral OFC subsequently. Now, again, I think we shouldn't overinterpret this because this is a single study and we shouldn't kind of overinterpret a null result in lateral, but that's just one speculation that one might have on this. So that just kind of summarizes. So you might imagine in lateral, you have these attribute representations, and then they're getting kind of integrated into a value signal in the medial OFC. Okay, let me just move on. So, and I think we're going to now show that maybe this story, we can think of it, there's an even more elaborate explanation, or should I say just a broader explanation about the involvement of different brain areas in this kind of attribute computation. Okay, so we go to art galleries, or at least we did before the pandemic went down. And we find pieces of art that we enjoy, images that we like or don't like. And how is it that the brain is capable of making these kinds of very quick, very snap decisions, right? So if you're on social media, you can, I guess on Instagram, I am actually not on Instagram, just disclosure, but you can, I guess you can do this, press these like buttons. Do I like this or not, right? And so we can do this fairly effortlessly. And so how does the brain actually accomplish this? How do we actually express preferences for things like images? Okay, how do we compute value for images? And what we have is, effectively a very high dimensional representation, right? It's a very high dimensional stimulus, and we're reducing it down to a very low dimension, which is, do I like it or not? Okay. And so we were interested in trying to understand this process. And you can think of it as kind of an extension of the work that we've just talked about in relation to food. And so Kyo Igaya in my lab took the lead on this and is responsible for it. What we were first interested in is, can we understand the type of transformation that the brain might do in order to transform an image into a preference, into a value. Now, this is obviously a little bit more, or quite considerably more complicated, at least superficially, than the food, because at least for the food, we can think, well, there are these attributes like the texture and protein and so on that at least kind of make biological sense that people would be using that information. But for art, it's kind of it's even more challenging. So this is just, just to remind you what we thought might be going on over for food, is that you kind of basically integrating these things like carb, fat, protein, and so on, and assigning weights to those to make a value. So what does it look like for art? Well, again, because of the enormous complexity, there are probably many, many features that the brain could potentially use. And so what we wanted to do is basically take an image and kind of building on the work that I showed you where we looked at the visual features that might be involved in food decisions. We looked to see, well, what are the features in a visual image that the brain might use? And so we can talk about low-level features. And those low-level features are things like, like we already talked about, the hue, the saturation, the amount of light, the smoothness of an image. You can also talk about the entropy in an image, the local entropy. And you can also just break images down into different segments. Okay, so there's computer vision tools that allow you to do that, right? So you might have, this might be a segment, and this might be a segment, and this might be a segment, so on. And you can then look for also those simple image statistics in those segments, okay? So you can basically end up with a large number of possible features. Okay, and those features will just have numerical values. How much of this what's the content? How much entropy is there in the image? How much entropy is there in this segment? So on. And you can think of those as low level, because they're basically just properties of the objective properties of the image that can be kind of extracted by a computer vision algorithm. Okay, and so Emanuela in my lab also was involved in. We used an off-the-shelf algorithm, and then she came up with a whole bunch of extra features as well. She was a kind of summer research student, so she did an enormously great job on this. But you can also talk about higher level attributes, okay, for art. So an example of a higher level attribute is, is the art concrete or abstract? Okay, so this would be an example of a relatively concrete piece of art, but you can of course talk about abstract art too. Does it convey a dynamic or still scene? Is the color temperature hot or cold? And does it have, what is the effective tone, right? So you can have, the Scream, for example, is a piece of art that has a negative effective tone, but still you might like that piece of art, right? So, but that's again, in like a content, an abstract or high level content in that image, okay? Or you could have something that's, showing a pleasant scene, right? So these are kind of features, and this, we didn't pull this from thin air. There is a whole rich literature on aesthetics in psychology. And so we kind of took our inspiration from a study by Leslie Fellows, and there was also work by Anjan Chatterjee, who was also working on these kinds of ideas. And so we took those features from them, and what we had is that we had people rate those features. So we actually had art experienced participants. So they had taken art courses, or they were from the Pasadena, I think, Art and Design College. I'm remembering the name of the college, but anyway, Center for Art and Design, I think. They came and they basically made these ratings for the images. Okay, we had a set of actually 1,000 images that came from WikiArt, and we got these ratings. And then we could use these ratings then to see if we could predict other people's preferences, liking ratings for the images. Okay. So what we did was then, we had people then just do a simple liking task. So they saw a piece of art and they said, well, how much do you like this? Give me a rating. And we used this kind of rather simple rating from 0 to 3 because we're going to do it in the scanner too. So we wanted to have, we only had 4 buttons in the scanner. So we said, we'll just make a 4-button rating. So we ran this study in lab, and for this, we had 7 participants. So it's a small sample size, but they're doing a lot of ratings, okay? So they came in and they did, rated 1,001 images. And that we also ran this on Amazon Turk. And in that case, we ran fewer images per subject, only I think 57 on average. But we got a lot more participants. So we got 1,359 participants, okay? So we got a lot of data on MTurk, and then we got a small number of participants, but a lot of data per participant in lab. Okay, so what we then did was, this is just looking at the in-lab data, is we can take all of those features, okay, the high level and the low level features. There's like 71 high level features that we had about, I guess, 71 low level features and about 4 or 5 high level features. And then we can just see, well, we can do a regression analysis and see whether can we predict people's liking ratings for the pieces of art by some linear combination of the weights over these attributes, okay, over these features. Okay. And this just shows you, don't worry so much about what I'm showing you here. It just gives an illustration of the average weights that people assign to these features. And obviously there is individual variation in what people assign to particular features. But you can see that actually a very important one is concreteness. Is it abstract or is it concrete art? And actually most people tend to like more concrete art. But there is a proportion of people that prefer abstract art. And so there's actually some kind of clustering of different types of preferences amongst people. But I'm not going to talk about that so much today. And it's not just concreteness. There's, if you take out concreteness, we can still predict preference way better than chance, even though that does seem to weigh very highly in people's preferences. So what we're now doing is we've taken this model, we've trained weights, and then we can say, well, can we predict people's preferences? Okay. And so what I'm showing you here is if I train the model, I train the weights on the same participant. Okay, so it's participant 1, and I take, 3/4 of their data, and then I test on a held out portion. Can I predict their preferences? Okay, with the model, and that's what you see in blue is yes, I can. Okay, and so this is very significantly above chance. You can run permutation testing to show that you can significantly predict their preferences based on these attributes, the weights over these attributes. We can also, though, do the same thing with other people. So we can train it on one set of participants, and then we can test it on another participant. So let's say we train it on 6 and we test it on the 7th, and then we circle around. And then we can still do pretty well, surprisingly well. So what it's showing you is that a lot of the variance we're picking up here is common variance across people in how they value art. And now I did mention that there is different clusters, but the majority of people really are kind of in this one cluster, which tends to be where they tend to like concrete art. So that's probably why we're seeing this. On average, we can predict people's preferences. And we could also train it on the in-lab data, and then we can let's test it on the MTurk participants. I'm sorry, the other way around. So I'm training it on the MTurk participants, and then I'm testing it on the in-lab people. And so that's what you're seeing here in orange. So even on a completely separate group of people that did this online, we can train the weights and we can still predict people who did the study in lab. So it's showing you about how a lot of these things are very common across people. So it's a surprising homogeneity in how people make these ratings. And then we can also see, well, how can we do predicting the MTurk data? And so we can train on MTurk and test on MTurk. And what we're doing there is we're training on a subset of participants, and we're testing on a held out participant. And we can do reasonably well. Or we can train on in-lab and test on MTurk, and we can still do really well. Or we can just take the low-level features only and not leave the high-level features out, and we can still do really well with the low-level features only. Okay, now obviously what we expect is that the low-level features are integrated over to produce judgments about high-level features, right? So this is kind of, again, what I'm alluding to, this hierarchical process. So does this work only for art images? What about other types of images? So we also took a photo database. So online, there's these, you can get these databases of different photographs, and then we could get people to make ratings on these photographs. And so we did this also in MTurk. Once again, oh, I think I'm actually missing that slide. I apologize. You're gonna have to take my word for it. Once again, we can predict people's preferences significantly better than chance if we train on art and test on photograph, or train on photograph and test on photographs. So again, there's even a commonality from across different modalities in terms of the features that are used. One little wrinkle here, which again, I'm sorry I don't have the slide to show you, is that it performs better if you train on photograph and test on art. It actually does better than if you train on art and test on photograph. And what that might reflect is that the photographs have much broader variance in the features because they're representing more naturalistic images. And so you can maybe get better training of the algorithm on these more naturalistic images than you can on the more restricted art set. Okay, so what we've shown so far is that this feature-based model predicts liking ratings very well. But one of the things that we were kind of concerned about was that there was a little bit of arbitrariness in how we selected these features. So, you know, we took prior work, prior studies and ideas that people had for features. And then we also just, you know, we took these computer vision algorithms, but we basically kind of curated the features that we were going to use. So we felt, well, maybe that's kind of not ideal. What you want to be able to do is have a mechanism of trying to see what features might the brain use in a more kind of organic way, right? Trying to understand what, you know, without us pre-selecting the features. So for this, we decided to use a deep neural network. So many of you will know what a deep neural network is. They've become very popular in machine learning, and they can solve all kinds of problems about recognizing objects, for example, that could not be done with traditional neural networks or other methods. And I guess they found their way into your smartphone, into Siri, into Alexa, and all these things for things like speech recognition and so on. And what this network does is it has layers of units, which are kind of loosely modeled on neurons. And those layers are connected together. And eventually there's an output layer whereby the model can make a decision, okay? And so what we did was we took one of these models, and actually you can get them off the shelf. So there's this thing called VGG model, VGG16. And it's basically an off-the-shelf model that's been trained on millions of images. And the weights that is basically setting the connections between layers are pre-trained. So what they're pre-trained on is object recognition. So can you kind of tell, is it a dog or a cat, and things like that. So, you know, you can run it on a corpus of internet images where the images are labeled, and then you can see, well, how well does it do in actually recognizing the object? And so we took this type of model that's been pre-trained, and then we said, okay, we're going to now do some additional training. We're going to get it to do liking ratings. So we assumed that it already had developed representations that's analogous to the visual system. And we know that actually from work, people like Jim DiCarlo at MIT and Nico Kriegeskorte down the road from you at Columbia, that actually you can see that the representations in these deep networks actually correlate with the activity patterns in different layers of the visual system, different areas of the visual system. So we said, well, maybe it's extracting the relevant features. And so we're going to train it now on basically doing liking ratings. So basically doing the art task. And so that's what we did. So you're actually only training the last 3 layers for that. And you're leaving the so-called convolutional layers unchanged. Although we can also train the convolutional layers too. What we then want to do is to see, well, how does this network do? And it does pretty well. So these are trained on this 7 participants data, and it's again doing much better than chance in recognizing people's preferences or in judging people's preferences. But one of the things we were interested in is, well, you know, are the low-level features that we came up with represented in the network? And if they are they represented in the early layers of the network as opposed to the later layers? Because that would be what you expect if these are the kind of low-level features that are being extracted from the visual image. And are the high-level features represented more deeper into the network, okay, in the later layers? And so what we did was then we took the activity in the network. We did a bunch of steps such as dimensionality reduction to reduce the activity in each layer to different principal components. And then what we could then do is do another machine learning algorithm on those to see whether we can decode, just like we tried to decode from the brain earlier, can we decode the features in the network? Okay, so we're not going near the brain at all. This is just purely on network and behavior. Can we see these features? And indeed we could. We could see that there are these features that are, for example, concreteness is represented more. This is showing you how much the information is present in different layers. So we're showing you for, I guess 16 layers here. And it's indeed, I guess we're showing for 15 layers. We're kind of leaving out the last one. Indeed, concreteness is more represented deeper in the network and less represented earlier in the network. And that's true also for dynamics. But some of the low-level features are actually represented more early on, which is what we would expect. But one of the things that actually, it wasn't always how we expected. So what we thought of as a high-level feature was the color temperature. And that actually turned out to be a low-level feature. It was more represented earlier on. And now we think about it, it kind of makes sense. But basically, this is a way of trying to understand what are low and high-level features in a way that's kind of data-driven. Okay. So the next question was, well, could we find evidence for these features being represented in the brain? So I realize my time is kind of running out. So can I have another 3 minutes, Rita? Is that okay? So we looked inside the brain. So we had participants, we scanned them with fMRI, and we had them do the art rating task. Actually, we had 6 participants. So this is a small number of people for an fMRI study, but we're scanning them over 4 days. So each person is being scanned. They're doing 1,000 trials each. So we're kind of doing more like a visual psychophysics approach to doing this type of fMRI study. So we had 6 people, and then we're looking to see, well, can we find in those 6 people representations of these features in the brain? First of all, we can say, well, can we see value signals? And yes, we do. So these are the 6 participants. And again, you see this VMPFC. In some people, it's more dorsal than in others, but that shows you that there's individual differences in this neuroanatomy that we often gloss over. But indeed, we see these value signals. And then we can say, well, let's look in the visual system and see if we find that the representation, as you move through the visual system, of the low versus high level features, are they changing? So what we're looking at here is the ratio of voxels that are correlated with low level features versus high level features in different regions of interest throughout the visual system. So there's the ventral visual stream and there's the dorsal visual stream, and we're using an existing anatomical map that's provided by another research group. And we're looking to see what's the representation of these different high level versus low level features. And what you can see in orange is that as you move through from V1 into kind of more higher order visual areas, such as parahippocampal areas, you get, in the ventral visual stream, you get more and more high level features represented proportionally versus in early V1, okay, in V1 areas. So what that's showing is that, perhaps not surprisingly, that the high level features get more represented as you move through the visual system, okay? And the low level features are more represented early on. And that's true both in the ventral stream and the dorsal stream, but less robustly in the dorsal stream. But you can also look in parietal and frontal regions, and there you find that actually the feature representations are more mixed. You see both high and low level features in these more higher order cortical areas. We can also look at what happens to the value signal. And the value signal, if you look within all these different regions, we're kind of pooling over early visual areas and higher order visual areas. And then you can see PPC, parietal cortex, and lateral prefrontal. That the value signals are progressively more represented as you move into medial prefrontal cortex, which again kind of fits with this idea that you're getting this kind of more robust representations of value as you move into the medial areas. And we can also see, well, imagine that these features are represented in these lateral areas, right? So including in the parietal cortex and lateral prefrontal cortex. You're getting these very mixed representations of features, and obviously you are getting feature representations in the early visual, but presumably to get to the orbital front or to the medial prefrontal, you need to kind of travel through the cortex. What we can do here is look for areas that are showing changes in connections, just like we did before for the food, at the time of decision making. So what areas are showing an increased activity between visual value signals in medial PFC and these feature representation regions in, for example, parietal and lateral prefrontal cortex. And what we find is that indeed connectivity is increased in these parietal and lateral prefrontal cortex areas at the time of decision making, suggesting that the information is being integrated at that time to compute the value. Okay, And the lateral prefrontal cortex includes the lateral orbital. It's kind of a rather large region of interest, but if you split it out, you still see lateral orbitals involved, but it's not just lateral orbital, it's all the lateral surface of the prefrontal cortex. Okay, so I'm going to kind of finish now, say that we've shown that there are these value signals that are actively constructed in the brain, and we can see that we can predict the value behaviorally of both food and art from underlying attributes in a lawful way. And that we can also model how this might emerge spontaneously in a neural network. And we can show that it's kind of a hierarchical process of feature extraction, going from the early visual, sensory areas to areas of higher order association cortex that are representing the features, which are then integrated to produce value in an active way. And I just want to finish by saying, well, we're not saying that all of the we've described all of the features that are being used. We think there's many other features that could be used, like memory, your idiosyncratic judgments, and so on, that we could predict better people's preferences at the individual level. But I think the general principle is that you're using these features and integrating over them to actively compute value. And I'd like to conclude by thanking all the people in my lab who worked on this, especially Kyo, Igaya, Sangyeon, Logan, and Shinsuke, who did most of the work I talked about today. Okay, thank you very much. I'm sorry for taking so long. I guess some things don't change from real talks.
John, thank you so much for a wonderful talk. I'm sorry I had this snafu with my PC that crashed in the middle, actually at the end. Thank you very much for the excellent talk. It's extremely relevant to our work, where we use pictures to model drug-seeking behavior in drug addiction, and where your work in prediction, trying to predict liking and value, is extremely relevant, because then we can maybe change it in some way. To reduce drug seeking or enhance healthy eating habits, etc. But I have several questions, but let me maybe reserve those and see what may be other questions that we have right now. So let me just read, okay, from Erin Rich. Hi John, fantastic talk. The medial lateral OFC differences in coding, attribute values. Now, you can either write in the chat, by the way, or raise a hand, and then I'll try to unmute you, okay? So, Erin, if you'd like me to read this, or maybe if we can unmute you somehow.
I'm trying to unmute you right now, Erin.
Okay, am I unmuted?
Yes.
Yes, perfect, perfect.
Thanks for a great talk. That was really
Thanks, Erin.
So my question, so I was really interested in your fMRI results about the medial lateral distinctions and attributes in more lateral OFC. And I'm curious what you think about this in relation to value-based choice, like between multiple options, because there's these ideas about whether choice takes place in the space of an integrated value or between attributes or some combination of that. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that I think that in fact this framework allows you to consider this as a kind of continuum, because of course the attributes that you use to, I think, you know, you are ultimately computing an integrated value. I mean, obviously one thing to bear in mind is that the brain doesn't respect any of these ideas that we have, right? It's just distributed activity, right? That is eventually leading to a choice. But I think if we're thinking about it conceptually, at least I favor the idea that there is an integrated value signal that's being used to drive choice. But the question is, what goes in to compute that integrated value? So it could be that you're focusing on particular features and not others. So you might be focusing, if you're thinking about classic kind of economic choice paradigms, we have magnitude and probability, you know, maybe you're focusing more on one than the other, depending on the task, depending on, you know, which things are most salient. And so I think, you know, one thing that went unsaid here is that, I mean, I think attention is going to play a role. And I actually don't like using the word attention. I hope I don't offend anybody, but I just find it so, you know, it's so, it can explain anything, right? It's kind of like a ghost in the machine. But I do think that, you know, we obviously do pay more attention to some features than others, and that's affecting the weights by which we integrate. And so I think that you can think of that, you know, what you're describing, this debate, insofar as it's debate, is really just reflecting, you know, what are the weights that are used at a particular moment in time, and how do people emphasize particular features when they're making choices. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, sort of. So are you thinking about it as like it could be a dynamic process, as in you emphasize the weight of one feature at one particular time and another feature at another, like within a decision, or under different contexts across decisions?
Well, that's a great question too. I mean, I can't say much about the dynamics within a decision based on the kind of fMRI data. We actually are planning to hopefully do studies in both mice and not me, I'm not going to do mice, but Kate Wassam, collaborator in UCLA, we're hoping to do that to look at kind of more at the, you know, fine-grained temporal decision making, you know, during a decision, what sort of features are used and how are they used over time. So I think you might indeed have dynamics over time going on. We're also hoping to do this in human patients that are getting recordings from single neuron recordings from orbital frontal cortex 2 to look at this too. We actually did run the ARC task in one patient, but we haven't analyzed it yet. But yes, I think it could be both, although I can't say much about what's going on at this point during the decision. But I think almost certainly as you move your attention around, even if you just look at eye movements, right, that humans make when they're making choices, they're going to focus on different attributes at different times. And I guess the prediction would be that that will influence the value, how the value gets integrated.
Mm-hmm.
Let's move on to the next question. Xiaoxi, would you like to say it or?
Yes.
Okay.
Hi, John. Thank you for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Yeah. So my question is, I guess this is a long-standing debate in the decision-making literature now about this idea of the common currency of values. And actually, just yesterday, I think Yao Nip posted a paper that you probably saw as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if we can touch on that a little bit. Do you think, you know, it's almost the topic of, is attention this ghost, or the idea of saliency this ghost that can explain everything? And people are feeling the same about value, right? Do you think that other types of other processes involved in decision making, such as policies, sometimes can be value independent, can somehow be incorporated into this framework or not?
Well, yeah, I mean, this framework doesn't, I mean, it's essentially talking about a linear integration, right? So you can call the end product of that linear integration an overall decision evidence if you want, right? Or you can call it a value signal. I mean, I tend to think that I find the use of a value signal useful. I mean, I'm not sure how much familiar everyone is going to be with this paper that just came out. But the idea that, you know, a policy and a value signal, they're very, very closely related to each other. You know, so in many ways, it's kind of like a little bit of a fight about details to some degree. So, you know, the way to think of a policy is it's basically a normalized value signal that essentially describes what your choice should be in a given context, and obviously probably affected by other things that are available at the time of choice, right? So if there are other choice options. So it's normalized by that. And I think the other way to say that is, well, value signals are getting normalized at the time of decision making. We know there's normalization that goes on. Various different people have argued for different kinds of normalization in different parts of the brain. And essentially a policy, I think of in reinforcement learning terms, is just a scaled value signal. So I think it's kind of a little bit of an artificial distinction. And the other thing I would say is that if you think about the organization of the brain, areas like ventral medial prefrontal cortex, ventral stratum, to some degree amygdala, they're not caring about policies. They're about, I mean, they're also involved in, you know, assigning value to things in which there is no, you know, in Pavlovian situations, right? So it's like, do I like something or not? And so I think that, you know, describing that as a policy is probably not that useful. I think it's much better to describe those kinds of signals as value. Whereas I think it is very, maybe useful to think about certain parts of the brain as doing policy, such as dorsal striatum and maybe in dorsal areas of the cortex that are involved in making decisions. Maybe at that point you can describe it as a policy. But again, I feel that that's a very, it's a very arcane thing that really only matters if you care about, particular types of reinforcement learning algorithms. I don't know if it's really that, a major critical distinction, but that's my feeling.
Yeah, it's a very elegant explanation, I think, for the different opinions. Thank you.
Sophia Dimopoulou, you had a question? Are you still there? So let me read it. Do the values of each feature in a piece of art change for a person as time passes, or are they fixed? So actually it relates to Arin's question, I think, right?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the answer is we don't know. What we do know, I mean, I suspect that that's very true. So, I did a little bit of a sort of, I guess when I was setting up the talk, I was kind of trying to diss reinforcement learning. That was kind of more like a, more of a framing thing. So, I mean, clearly we learn about features through reinforcement learning, right? So that's, I think, arguably what it does. And we can learn about the value of things. So clearly if I like, a piece of art one day, and then I had a very bad experience that is where that piece of art gets associated with something bad that happens to me, then clearly those, features in that art the value will change. So, clearly there's experience dependent things going on all the time, and they're probably really important. I mean, I'm not even, I'm saying that they're still vital, right, for how we compute value. And similarly, for food, if I develop, a taste aversion, or I need to go on a diet or something, then clearly my value, those features are changing over time. So the dynamical component of this model is that you can flexibly, those weights can flexibly change. Now, how they do it, we don't know yet, but that's the kind of idea. So indeed, over time, and I'm sure it's true in art too, those kinds of features will change. As so for example, I guess the canonical example would be if you get trained as an artist, right? So probably if you're not trained as an artist, you like, certain types of landscapes and so on, very concrete things, but maybe over time you develop a richer understanding, and then you change the weights on the features. So I think that's very much likely to be the case. Yeah.
Okay, and the last question we have here in the chat by Offer Pearl. Are you there, Offer?
Yeah, you kind of answered my question already, but I was wondering, do the experts diverge from lay person just by having different features in mind when they evaluate art?
Yeah, that's a great question. We haven't explicitly compared real experts. So we did have the people who were the experts. They were doing the rating the attributes, but they weren't the people that were doing the ratings. So it is a good question. We did have a variable which was kind of in the MTurk, which measured art expertise, and I don't think we saw any effect of that. But I would take that way maybe with a grain of salt. I mean, my expectation would be that there would be a difference. And what I expect is that, what I didn't talk about is that while we can predict people's preferences on average, there are about 4 clusters of people with different types of weights. And some people are very much more about weighting abstract art. They like it more, and they do use different features. So I think, probably it would be true that if you took real art experts and did this, they would have different features. I think so. But we don't have very strong, good evidence for that. Right. One thing I will say is that Anjan Chatterjee compared experts versus non-experts on their ability to recognize features in the art, and he didn't see a difference.
Okay, the connection got a little bit lower there, but let's just have one more question and then we can thank you. And the time is a little bit, it's okay.
We're way over time. We really do have to wrap this up.
One last question by Jacob Dial-Fuchel. Is it there, Jacob?
Hold 1 second.
Yes, I just wanted to know if you could speculate about the effect on evaluations, if the lateral and medial orbital prefrontal cortex were stimulated?
Oh yeah, that's a great question, and it is also something we're hoping to do at some point too. And I guess that if you were to, our prediction would be if you were to disrupt lateral orbital frontal, that presumably you would disrupt the value computation in the medial. I mean, I would expect that that would be true. I mean, I think you can interpret to some degree our food study, the lesion study I briefly talked about, although there's other stuff going on there, as reflecting the fact that they're not integrating, they have damage to VMPFC, which includes, of course, in the lesion study, it's not very precise, right? Because the lesions extend, into lateral orbital too, in some patients. That when you have disruption to those areas, that you're not able to flexibly update your value in the same way. And of course, that fits with a lot of animal studies too, where you have lesions in those structures. So yeah, I would expect the disruption would impact on the ability to flexibly compute value. And I think there is a work by Thorsten Kant, who looked at stimulation in lateral orbital, which did impact on the ability to change the value following satiation fit. What would be even more interesting would be to actually, if you identify an individual feature representation and then you stimulate that feature representation, could you change the value specifically for that population of neurons that represent a particular feature? And that's hopefully what we're planning to do in mice and maybe even in humans if we can do it with intracranial electrical stimulation. But that's all pipe dream at the moment.
Okay, John, let me thank you very much on behalf of everybody for your time and for a wonderful, very insightful, thought-provoking presentation. I'm sure you have other things now on your list and we're running a little bit late. So thank you on behalf of everybody who are muted, basically. And I'll see you later.
Thank you. Bye-bye.